The next move is not yours, though every muscle in you may be straining to make it so. You have lived long enough under the illusion that progress depends upon your cleverness, your timing, your persistence, your ability to push one more door that seems firmly shut. And yet, if you are honest, most of the moments that truly changed you arrived unannounced, unplanned, and often unwanted. They came like a knock in the night, startling and inconvenient, but carrying with them a weight that no careful strategy could ever have produced. It is here, in this unsettling recognition, that faith begins to speak more loudly than effort. Not because effort is worthless, but because effort was never meant to sit on the throne. There is a peculiar anxiety that grips the human heart when it senses that waiting is required. We would rather be told to climb a mountain than to sit still at its base. Action flatters our sense of importance. Waiting exposes our dependence. And dependence is precisely what we resist, for it reminds us that we are not self-created, not self-sustaining, and certainly not self-redeeming. Yet the great reversals of life rarely occur at the moment we force them. They occur when we are interrupted by something greater than our plans, something that does not ask for our permission, before rearranging the furniture of our lives. Consider how often you have mistaken motion for meaning. You moved, therefore you assumed you were advancing. You struggled, therefore you believed you were faithful. But there are seasons when motion is merely noise, and struggle is only pride dressed up as virtue. In such seasons, God does not scold you with thunder. He simply withdraws the sense of control you once enjoyed and leaves you face to face with the terrifying truth that you cannot manufacture the future. You can prepare for it, yes. You can pray toward it, you can hope in it, but you cannot command it. This is where many hearts grow bitter. They say, if God intends to act, why does he delay? But delay is only visible from the position of impatience. From the vantage point of eternity, what you call delay may be careful alignment. What you call silence may be restraint. We imagine God as idle because he is not hurried, forgetting that haste is a symptom of limitation. One rushes only when one fears running out of time. God does not rush because time itself is not his enemy. You have likely noticed that the most significant transformations in your life did not begin with clarity, but with confusion. Something fell apart before something else could take its place. A relationship fractured, a career stalled, a certainty dissolved. You stood there, surveying the wreckage, convinced that you had failed or been abandoned. Yet it is often precisely at this moment that the next move becomes possible, not because you are ready, but because you are no longer pretending to be in control. Pride thrives on continuity. Humility is born in disruption. There is a strange mercy in reaching the end of your own strategies. When every familiar lever has been pulled and nothing has shifted, you are finally positioned to see that the machinery was never yours to operate. Faith, in its truest form, is not confidence that God will bless your plans, but trust that his plans do not require your anxiety to succeed. This trust does not make you passive. On the contrary, it demands a deeper courage, the courage to obey without understanding the full map, the courage to stand when standing looks like foolishness, the courage to wait when waiting feels like loss. You may feel as though your life is suspended between breaths, neither moving forward nor falling back, simply hovering in an uncomfortable stillness. Do not be deceived into thinking this is wasted time. The seed does not sprout the moment it is planted, yet it is doing the most important work precisely when nothing appears to be happening. Beneath the surface, unseen and uncelebrated, something is taking shape that could not survive the light too early. God often hides his greatest work in the places we are least inclined to look, because if we saw it too soon, we would interfere. We speak often about surrender, but rarely about how humiliating it feels. In practice, surrender is not a poetic gesture performed at a distance. It is the daily, sometimes hourly decision to loosen your grip on outcomes you care deeply about. It feels like weakness because it strips away the illusion that your strength was ever sufficient. And yet, in this stripping, something truer emerges. When you finally admit that the next move is not yours, you are not confessing defeat, you are confessing reality. Notice how often God's work in Scripture unfolds through people who are acutely aware of their inadequacy, not the confident heroes we might expect, but the reluctant, the uncertain, the ones who argue with God rather than eagerly volunteer. Their hesitation is not celebrated, but neither is it disqualifying. It becomes instead the very space where God's power is made visible. For if the outcome cannot be attributed to human brilliance, it must be attributed elsewhere. This is deeply offensive to our modern sensibilities. We prefer narratives where success can be traced back to discipline, intelligence, or resilience. We want formulas, not mysteries. But faith is not a technique for manipulating divine outcomes. It is a relationship that reshapes how we understand outcomes altogether. When God moves, he does not merely adjust circumstances, he reorders values. What once seemed essential becomes secondary. What once seemed unbearable becomes survivable. What once seemed impossible becomes quietly and without fanfare real. There is also a bearing truth we must confront. Sometimes God's next move dismantles what you have been praying to preserve. Not because your prayers were wrong, but because your vision was too small. You asked for relief, he intends renewal. You asked for stability, he intends growth. And growth, as you well know, rarely feels gentle while it is happening. We confuse God's kindness with our comfort, forgetting that a surgeon's care often involves a knife. If you listen closely, you may hear a persistent whisper beneath your fear, telling you that if you do not act now, everything will be lost. This voice speaks urgently, breathlessly, as though the universe itself were balanced on your next decision. But urgency is not always truth. Sometimes it is simply fear wearing the mask of responsibility. God's guidance does not usually shout, it steadies. It does not demand panic, it invites trust. And trust grows not by controlling the future, but by recognizing who holds it. You are not being asked to abandon reason, nor to despise effort. You are being asked to place them in their proper place. Reason is a tool, not a ruler. Effort is an offering, not a guarantee. When you elevate them beyond their design, they collapse under the weight of expectations they were never meant to carry. God's move, when it comes, will not require you to become less human, but more honest about your humanity. It is a particular freedom that arrives when you stop rehearsing every possible outcome. The mind grows, weary from endless speculation, and the heart grows numb from repeated disappointment imagined in advance. By attempting to foresee every turn, you end up living fragments of future sorrows that may never arrive. Faith calls you back into the present, not as an escape from responsibility, but as a refusal to borrow trouble that does not yet exist. You might ask how to know when God is about to move. The uncomfortable answer is that you often do not, at least not in the way you would prefer. The signs are rarely dramatic. They appear instead as subtle shifts, a door that closes without bitterness, a desire that loosens its grip, a peace that arrives without explanation. These are not proofs, but invitations. They ask you to trust that the author has not abandoned the story simply because you cannot see the next page. And so you stand, perhaps at a crossroads you did not choose, feeling both the weight of expectation and the ache of uncertainty. You may be tempted to force clarity where none has been given, to label ambiguity as failure. Resist this temptation. Clarity is not the same as faith, and certainty is not the same as obedience. There are moments when the most faithful response is not decisive action, but attentive stillness. Stillness, however, is not emptiness. It is a posture of readiness. It is the quiet alignment of your will with something larger than your immediate desires. In stillness, you begin to notice how much of your striving was driven not by love, but by fear, fear of being forgotten, fear of falling behind, fear of not mattering. God's move, when it comes, addresses these fears not by indulging them, but by exposing their exaggeration. You matter, not because you are indispensable, but because you are loved. There is also this paradox to consider. When you finally accept that the next move is God's, you often find yourself more active, not less. Freed from the burden of outcomes, you can act with integrity rather than desperation. You can choose what is right without calculating how it will be rewarded. You can speak truth without rehearsing how it will be received. This is not resignation, it is liberation. Many people live as though God were a distant observer, occasionally intervening if properly persuaded. But the deeper reality is far more unsettling and far more hopeful. God is not merely watching your life, He is weaving it. Threads that seem contradictory now will, in time, reveal a coherence you could not have designed. But weaving requires tension. A loose thread contributes nothing to the pattern. You may not yet see how this waiting, this uncertainty, this relinquishing of control could possibly shift everything. That is understandable. Shifts are rarely announced in advance. They are recognized in retrospect, when you look back and realize that what felt like an ending was actually a orientation, a turning of the soil rather than the collapse of the field. You did not lose direction. Direction was quietly redefined. At the time, it felt like standing in a fog where even familiar landmarks disappeared, but fog does not erase the landscape. It merely humbles the traveler, slowing the pace so that each step is taken with care rather than arrogance. There is a subtle cruelty in assuming that God's work must always feel impressive. We expect thunder, where there is often only breath, spectacle where there is usually patience. Yet the most enduring changes are rarely theatrical. They seep into the bones of a person, altering instincts, reshaping reflexes, teaching the heart new habits long before the mind understands what has happened. When God moves, He often begins where you are least inclined to applaud, in character rather than circumstance. You may find yourself grieving a version of life that never came to pass, and this grief can feel like a betrayal of faith. But grief is not unbelief. It is love searching for somewhere to rest. To grieve what might have been is to acknowledge that your hopes were sincere. God is not threatened by this honesty. He is far more concerned with pretense than with sorrow. A heart that admits its disappointment is far closer to truth than one that hides behind forced optimism. There is a danger in idolizing clarity. We imagine that if God would only explain Himself, obedience would become easy. But explanation does not produce trust. Relationship does. Even when reasons are given, they rarely satisfy the deeper ache, because the ache is not intellectual, but relational. We do not merely want to know what God is doing. We want to know that He is near, and nearness is often felt most strongly when explanations are withheld. As you wait, you may notice a strange narrowing of your world. Options that once seemed plentiful fall away. Distractions lose their appeal. The noise dims. This narrowing is not a punishment, it is a focusing. A river gathers strength as it narrows, not as it spreads thin across a wide plain. God often reduces the field of vision so that you can see what actually matters, rather than what merely sparkles. You have likely been told that faith means certainty, that doubt is a defect to be corrected as quickly as possible. But doubt, when faced honestly, can become a doorway rather than a dead end. It exposes where your trust was resting on assumptions rather than on God Himself. When those assumptions collapse, you are given the opportunity to rebuild on something sturdier. This rebuilding is slow, often uncomfortable, but it produces a faith that can withstand silence as well as affirmation. Notice how easily impatience disguises itself as zeal. You tell yourself that you are eager to serve, eager to move forward, eager to make a difference. And perhaps you are, but eagerness becomes dangerous when it refuses to listen. God's timing is not an obstacle to His will, it is an expression of it. To run ahead of Him is not devotion but distraction. There is also the quiet fear that if God takes the next move, you may not like where He leads. This fear is not irrational. God does not exist to preserve your preferences. He exists to restore your soul. And restoration often requires the removal of things you have come to rely on too heavily. Yet even here, there is mercy. God rarely strips away without also providing. Though the provision may not resemble what was taken, you may be tempted to measure God's activity by external markers, success, approval, visible progress. But these are unreliable gauges. Some of the most obedient lives leave little trace in public memory, while some of the most celebrated achievements are hollow at the core. God's economy does not align neatly with ours. He measures faithfulness where we measure outcomes, and love where we measure efficiency. As the waiting continues, you might experience an odd mixture of weariness and hope. Weariness from carrying unanswered questions, hope from the sense that the story is not finished. This tension is not a flaw in faith, it is one of its defining features. To live by faith is to inhabit the space between promise and fulfillment, without demanding that the space be shortened for your comfort. There are moments when obedience feels small, almost laughably insignificant. Choosing kindness when bitterness would be easier. Choosing honesty when exaggeration would be rewarded. Choosing rest when productivity is praised. These choices rarely feel heroic, yet they shape a life more decisively than grand gestures ever could. God's move often builds upon these unnoticed acts, stacking them quietly until their weight becomes undeniable. You may wonder whether your prayers have any effect at all, especially when circumstances remain stubbornly unchanged. But prayer is not merely a request line, it is a reorientation. In prayer, you are reminded that you are not the axis around which reality turns. This reminder is not meant to diminish you, but to relieve you. The universe does not rest on your shoulders, and that is good news. There is a humility that comes from recognizing how little of life is actually under your control. At first, this recognition can feel frightening, even paralyzing, but in time it can become a source of peace. If you were never meant to control everything, then your failures in control are not evidence of worthlessness, but confirmation of design. You are finite by intention, not by accident. God's move, when it arrives, will not be a reaction to your panic. It will not be hurried by your fear or delayed by your mistakes. This does not mean your choices are irrelevant, but it does mean they are not ultimate. You participate in the story, but you do not author it. There is a profound relief in letting that truth settle, even if it takes time to stop resisting it. You may also discover that waiting exposes hidden attachments. Things you thought were optional reveal themselves as necessities you cannot imagine living without. Ambitions, identity, ease, relationships, even wounds can become anchors rather than sails. God's delay often shines a light on these attachments, not to shame you, but to free you. Freedom is rarely given all at once. It is learned through repeated acts of letting go. There is something deeply countercultural about trusting an unseen hand in a world obsessed with visible results. You will likely be misunderstood. Some will assume you are passive or unmotivated. Others will interpret your patience as fear. But faith does not require the approval of onlookers. It requires alignment with truth, even when that alignment costs you admiration. As time stretches on, you may notice that your prayers begin to change. They become less about outcomes and more about transformation, less about escape and more about endurance. This change is not resignation, it is maturity. A child asks for circumstances to change. An adult asks for the strength to live well within them. God honors both, but he often answers the second more deeply. There is a peculiar kindness in the way God prepares you for what is coming without fully revealing it. Full knowledge might overwhelm you, or worse, tempt you to rely on yourself. Instead, you are given enough light for the next step, and no more. This measured illumination keeps you dependent, not as a punishment, but as a protection. You might be surprised to find that as you release control, joy begins to surface in unexpected places. Not the loud joy of triumph, but the quiet joy of alignment. The joy of knowing that you are where you are meant to be, even if you do not yet know where that is leading. This joy does not eliminate sorrow, but it coexists with it, steady and unassuming. When God moves, the shift often feels obvious only in hindsight. At the time it may feel like coincidence or chance. But faith trains the eye to see patterns where others see randomness. Not because you are naive, but because you have learned to recognize the fingerprints of a faithful presence woven through ordinary events. You may still feel the urge to hurry things along, to give God a helpful suggestion or two. This impulse does not disqualify you. It simply reminds you that trust is learned gradually, through repetition rather than resolution. Each time you choose patience over panic, you strengthen a muscle that will be needed later. There is also this truth to hold gently. God's move may not vindicate you in the way you secretly hope. It may not prove your critics wrong or reward your endurance with public affirmation. Sometimes the shift is entirely internal, a reconfiguration of desires so complete that the need for vindication evaporates. You are no longer driven to be right, only to be faithful. You are being shaped for something that cannot yet be named, something that requires the person you are becoming, not merely the person you have been. This shaping feels slow because it is thorough. God is not interested in quick fixes that leave the foundation on untouched. He works at a depth that patience alone can reach. And so you remain here, between what was and what will be, learning the difficult art of trust. Not the trust that denies fear, but the trust that acknowledges fear without obeying it. Not the trust that demands immediate answers, but the trust that believes answers exist even when they are withheld. The next move is not yours, and this truth, unsettling as it may feel, is also the source of your greatest hope, because it means the weight of shifting everything does not rest on your limited strength, but on a purpose far steadier than your uncertainty, far wiser than your plans, and far more patient than your fear. And in this patience something continues to unfold quietly, persistently, shaping not only what will happen, but who you will be when it does, drawing you deeper into a way of seeing where even the waiting itself becomes a form of movement, a slow but deliberate turning toward a future that is already being prepared beyond the reach of your control, and just within the reach of your trust. That trust, however, is not a static thing you acquire once and then store neatly away. It behaves more like a living muscle, strengthened through use and weakened through neglect. Each day presents small invitations to rely less on your own foresight and more on a wisdom that does not announce itself with urgency. You are tempted to think that only the grand decisions matter, but it is in the ordinary moments that trust is either cultivated or quietly eroded. The way you respond to delay, to misunderstanding, to uncelebrated obedience shapes the inner posture with which you will eventually meet the larger shift. You may notice that as you wait, memories surface with unusual clarity, old regrets, past mistakes, conversations you wish you could revise. Waiting has a way of unearthing what busyness once kept buried. This too is not accidental. God does not waste the stillness. He allows these memories to rise not to condemn you, but to heal places you learn to ignore. Healing is rarely dramatic. It is often repetitive, requiring you to revisit the same truth until it finally sinks beneath the surface of habit and belief. There is a subtle temptation to romanticize the future as compensation for the present. You tell yourself that once God moves, everything will make sense and joy will be uninterrupted. But this expectation places an impossible burden on what is to come. The future was never meant to redeem the present. God works within time, not in opposition to it. The shift he brings will not eliminate struggle, it will reframe it, giving it meaning rather than erasing it. As the illusion of control fades, you may feel strangely exposed, as though some protective layer has been removed. Without your usual plans and contingencies, you are left more vulnerable to disappointment. Yet vulnerability is not weakness in the economy of faith, it is honesty. And honesty is the soil in which real transformation grows. God does not require you to be invulnerable. He invites you to be available. You may begin to recognize how often your sense of worth was tied to usefulness. When you were productive, helpful, or admired, you felt secure. When you were sidelined or unseen, you felt diminished. Waiting disrupts this equation. It confronts you with the uncomfortable truth that your value does not increase with activity, nor decrease with stillness. You are valued not for what you produce, but for who you are in relation to the one who called you. There is also a refining of perception that occurs in these seasons. You start to distinguish between noise and guidance, between urgency and importance. Voices that once carried weight lose their authority, while quieter truths gain clarity. This refinement does not happen overnight. It emerges gradually, through repeated discernment, through learning to pause before reacting, through allowing space for wisdom to surface rather than forcing a response. You might wonder whether God's silence is a test, but tests imply distance, and God's silence often implies nearness of a different kind. It is the silence of a teacher who knows the student must wrestle with the lesson to truly understand it. Constant instruction can create dependence, but well-timed silence invites growth. In this silence, you learn not only to listen, but to recognize the subtle ways God has already been speaking. There is a humility that develops and you realize how often your previous certainties were provisional. What you once defended fiercely, you now hold loosely. What once seemed non-negotiable now appears contextual. This humility is not a loss of conviction, but a refinement of it. It allows you to remain firm without becoming rigid, faithful without becoming brittle. As you remain attentive, you may find that the world around you continues at a pace that feels indifferent to your inner struggle. Others move forward, celebrate milestones, announce achievements. Comparison creeps in quietly, whispering that you are falling behind. But behind what exactly? The timelines you compare yourself to are often arbitrary, shaped by cultural expectations rather than divine intention. God does not rush you because he is not competing. There is a peculiar courage required to trust that your life is not late in becoming meaningful, not late in bearing fruit, not late in being used. This courage grows as you release the need to justify your season to others. You are not required to explain waiting to those who measure life by speed. Some truths can only be lived, not defended. You may also discover that waiting sharpens compassion. Having known uncertainty yourself, you become more patient with the uncertainties of others. Having sat with unanswered questions, you become less quick to offer shallow solutions. This compassion is not sentimental, it is grounded in shared fragility. God often deepens your capacity to love by allowing you to experience limitation firsthand. There is a shift that occurs when you stop asking, "When will this end?" and begin asking, "Who am I becoming here?" The first question focuses on escape, the second on formation. God is not indifferent to your desire for relief, but he is deeply invested in your transformation. The person you are becoming will matter long after the current circumstances have changed. You might notice that your faith becomes less performative and more private. Fewer declarations, more quiet commitments, less emphasis on appearing strong, more willingness to admit weakness. This inward turn is not a retreat from the world, but a grounding that prepares you to engage it more honestly. Roots grow in darkness before they ever support visible growth. There is also a reckoning with motives. Waiting exposes why you wanted certain outcomes so desperately. Was it love or validation? Was it obedience or control? These questions can be uncomfortable, but they are clarifying. God's move, when it comes, will not merely give you what you want, it will align your wants with what is good. You may find yourself re-examining old definitions of success. What once seemed essential now feels optional. What once felt optional now feels essential. This reordering is subtle but profound. It changes how you invest your energy, how you spend your time, how you measure a day well lived. God's work often begins with redefining what you are aiming for. As days pass, you might catch glimpses of meaning in small, almost forgettable moments. A conversation that arrives at just the right time. A sentence read that seems to speak directly to your situation. A sense of calm that appears without explanation. These are not proofs, but reminders. They whisper that you are not unseen, that the story is active even when it feels slow. There is a danger, however, in turning these moments into demands. Expectation can harden into entitlement if you are not careful. God's kindness is not a contract. Gratitude keeps the heart open, entitlement closes it. The shift you await is a gift, not a transaction. You may be tempted to prepare for every possible outcome, believing that preparedness will protect you from disappointment. but excessive preparation can become another form of control. There is a difference between wisdom and anxiety disguised as foresight. Wisdom acknowledges uncertainty and moves forward with trust. Anxiety tries to eliminate uncertainty altogether and is never satisfied. As you practice releasing control, you might notice resistance surfacing in unexpected ways. Irritability, restlessness, even cynicism. These are often signs that something deeper is being challenged. Control does not surrender quietly, but neither does it ultimately prevail. Each act of trust weakens its grip. There is also the quiet realization that some doors once closed will not reopen. Waiting does not guarantee restoration of everything lost. This truth can be painful, but it is also freeing. It allows you to grieve honestly rather than clinging to false hope. God's move is not always about returning you to where you were, but about leading you somewhere new. You may sense that the ground beneath your identity is shifting. Roles you once occupied comfortably no longer fit. Labels that once defined you feel restrictive. This disorientation is unsettling, but it is also an invitation. When familiar identities loosen, you are given the chance to discover who you are apart from them. God often strips away titles before revealing purpose. As the season continues, patience begins to feel less like endurance and more like attentiveness. You are no longer merely surviving the wait, you are learning within it. You notice patterns, recognize growth, acknowledge progress that would have been invisible before. This learning does not make the wait easy, but it makes it meaningful. There is a growing awareness that God's move will not simply change circumstances, it will change how you inhabit them. You will respond differently to success and failure, to praise and criticism, to certainty and doubt. This internal shift is often the most significant one, though it attracts the least attention. You might also find that your prayers become simpler. Fewer words, more presence. Less explanation, more listening. Prayer becomes less about persuading God and more about aligning yourself with what is already unfolding. This simplicity, thank you, is not a reduction of faith, but a deepening of it. As time stretches, hope takes on a quieter tone. It is no longer fueled by excitement, but by steadiness. This hope does not fluctuate wildly with circumstances. It rests on something deeper than optimism. It is the confidence that meaning exists, even when it is not immediately visible. You may still feel the ache of not knowing what comes next. That ache does not disappear simply because you trust. But it changes. It becomes less sharp, less frantic. It coexists with a growing sense of peace, not because questions are answered, but because you are no longer demanding that they be answered on your terms. And so you continue, step by step, breath by breath, learning to live without forcing resolution, learning to act without insisting on immediate results, learning to trust that the unseen work is no less real than what can be measured. The next move is not yours, and in this truth you find not passivity, but participation of a different kind, a willingness to be shaped as much as to be used, to be formed as much as to be sent, remaining open to the slow, deliberate work that is still unfolding, still aligning, still preparing a shift that will arrive not as a spectacle, but as a continuation of a story that has been quietly moving all along. So let this be the place where striving finally loosens its grip and trust is allowed to stand upright without apology. Not because every question has been answered, nor because the path ahead is suddenly clear, but because you have learned something deeper than certainty. You have learned that your life is not suspended over a void, but held within a purpose that does not falter when you do. The waiting was not empty. The silence was not absence. The delay was not denial. All of it was shaping a heart capable of receiving what haste would have ruined. When God makes his move, it will not announce itself with the drama you once expected. It will arrive with the quiet authority of truth, settling into place with a rightness you recognize before you can explain it. You will look back and see that nothing was wasted, not the tears, not the confusion, not the long nights of questioning. What felt like standing still was, all along, a deeper kind of forward motion. You were being prepared not just for a change in circumstances, but for a transformation in vision. And so you move forward now, not with clenched fists, but with open hands, not driven by fear of missing out, but anchored in the knowledge that what is meant for you cannot pass you by. The next move was never yours to force, only yours to trust. And in that trust, everything truly begins to shift.